Hey guys, welcome back. And if you're new here, I'm Jim, and this video is a review of the Viltrox 35mm f1.8 FE lens, which is a fixed focal length 35mm prime lens with a bright aperture of f1.8 designed specifically for Sony full-frame cameras. It's a very useful and versatile focal length at 35mm, great for everyday lens, walk-around use, and works particularly well in cities and for street photography, but can also be used for landscapes and other things. It's this lens right here, which looks great on the camera. It feels great in the hand. It's solidly built. I'll be walking through all of that, and I'll also be sharing a lot of sample photos. It's frankly a great value at $399 US, and I do want to thank the nice folks at Viltrox for sending this lens for me to test out. Although, to be clear, everything in this video and in this review is based on my own experience in the field, and they did not ask to preview any of this before I shared it. I also want to point out that this review is from the standpoint of a photographer. While you can obviously take video with this lens, I'm a photographer, and thus this review is from that point of view. Just wanted to clarify that up front. Having said all that, let's get into the review. The lens is metal construction, feels really good in the hand. As you can see, there is a 55mm thread on the front of the lens, and overall it just feels really solid and well built. The focusing ring is also metal and is really smooth as you adjust that, and of course there is an adjustable aperture ring. Aperture varies between f1.8 and f16 with some slight resistance between those settings, and there is also an automatic aperture setting that once clicked over to allows you to adjust the aperture in camera. Looking at the bottom of the lens, you can see that there is a USB-C port for firmware updates. And of course, that is all metal construction as well. Overall, I'm very pleased with the build quality, the durability, and just the feeling of the lens in hand. It feels very solid, very well built, and you can see that a lot of attention to detail was put into the thought and the construction of this lens. Okay, and now we're going to take a look at some photographs. I've been out shooting quite a bit in Austin with this lens. I've shot some landscapes and a number of shots in the city. Now, a lens like this can work for landscapes, although I think traditionally many people would prefer a wider focal length for landscapes. However, again, depending on the situation and your ability to move up or back, it can work quite well. So here's an example of a photograph I took. You can see it's not exactly a really wide field of view, but you can get in and still capture nice landscapes with a 35mm focal length. Here's another example of a landscape, and for me a 35mm focal length when using it for landscapes is kind of what I consider approaching what I would call kind of an intimate landscape. You're not getting the really wide point of view, but you can zoom in, for lack of a better word. Of course, you're not zooming because it's a prime lens, but you're basically focused in on a smaller component of the landscape. So a scene like this can work quite well, where you've got leading lines, you've got this boat coming down the middle, and it gives a sense of the landscape without capturing the entire wide view of it. This one was shot at f1.8, and by the way, I should note that every photograph in this review video was taken handheld. And one of the things I like about the f1.8 aperture is, of course, that even in lower light, you're able to reel off shots quickly and accurately because of that f1.8. I do find that the focusing is very solid. Even in lower light, it locks on quite well. Here's another shot of that same scene a little bit later as it's gotten darker. As you can see on the right-hand side, I'm still at f1.8 and ISO 100, and yet even in lower light, I'm able to get a nice crisp image that looks beautiful. As I zoom in, you can still see nice detail in this photo, and just to be clear, these photos are unedited, but you can see I think this lens has done a great job capturing that scene handheld at f1.8. Now there is something to be aware of, and that is that I've noticed some vignetting at the wide open or bright aperture of f1.8, although as you move through and tighten up the aperture a little bit, that disappears quickly. So let me show you. Here's a scene. I did shoot this scene, by the way, because I took multiple photos. I took these on a tripod just to make sure they lined up the same, but here it is at f1.8, and you can see a little bit of vignetting, but as I go to the next one, which is f2, you can see it's a little bit brighter in the corners. Now at f2.2, that vignette is effectively gone, but if I back up 2 photos, you can really see that there is some vignetting there around those edges. So again, at f1.8, wide open aperture, I am finding some vignetting, but as I go to 2.0 and 2.2, it's effectively gone. And then as I pass through tighter and tighter apertures, it is effectively diminished completely. I also find that right down the center, it's really sharp here at f1.8. Now, if you go to the corners, of course, it's going to be a little bit softer, but I would expect that with an f1.8 aperture. At f2, corners are slightly improved, still really sharp in the center. At f2.2, continues to stay really sharp in the center, and really I'm starting to get a bit more visibility and detail there in those corners. At 2.5, I think it looks really good, and of course the center continues to stay crisp as well. So it's just something to be aware of. Slightly soft in some of the corners at the bright aperture, but I would expect that, to be honest, but also some vignetting that you're going to see at f1.8, but by f2.2 and 2.5, it's effectively gone. Now that we've briefly covered landscapes and the vignetting that I see, I do want to walk through some city shots because for me, a 35mm f1.8 lens is a perfect walk-around lens for city shots day or night. So I want to walk through some shots that I took in daylight with this lens, but then also some in lower light. Here's an example of shooting at f1.8 and that really dreamy, kind of creamy background blur that you can get by shooting at that wide open aperture. This one's also at f1.8, but just shot straight down the middle and focused in the distance. And so I'm not getting that background blur, but I'm getting a nice scene that's frankly pretty well lit. And honestly, the vignetting is not as pronounced here as it was in some of the other photos. Here's another example at f1.8. Again, just shot straight down the middle. While the background is obviously slightly defocused, I think the center of this photo is nice and sharp, which is of course where I was focused. And once again, I think the vignetting, although I can see it here slightly, it's not that pronounced. Here's another example of focusing in close on something and allowing that background to really get blurred and kind of dreamy. You can see that a lot of these little light balls, what I like to call bokeh balls, really have a nice shape to them. They're round, and I think it looks honestly great in the background. Here's another example of a nicely blurred background. I honestly just think that looks fantastic. Very soft and kind of dreamy looking, which is exactly what I would want it to look like. Now, of course, when you're backed up a little bit and not as close to something, you can get a nice scene in focus at f1.8 like this, where I have this wall in focus, slight blur to the background, really more of a lack of sharpness. But again, I'm focused on this mural here on the wall. And another example of a similar scene, just focused on the wall in front of me here. And again, at f1.8, slightly defocused or unsharp background. Again, to be expected at f1.8. Honestly, I think this looks really nice. It's super crisp right here in the center, which is exactly where I was focused. And one more example of just a wide scene, and this one does illustrate some of the vignetting that I've talked about. Again, f1.8 shot straight down the middle. You can see there's definitely some vignetting here, but overall, I mean, this looks really sharp and crisp, especially here in the center, despite the fact that the corners might be a little bit dark, but even so, they look pretty crisp to my eye, and that is also at f1.8. And now let's look at some low light photos, because again, in addition to regular walk around daytime shots with that 35mm, I think low light shots are really where this is going to shine because of that bright aperture. So this is f1.8 at ISO 1000, focused on this pole here, and you can see the background's blurred out nicely. It really looks soft and smooth. Here's an f1.8. I'm about 15 feet back from this wall, but you can see, honestly, the vignetting doesn't look bad or much very well pronounced. You know, if you look in the corners, I mean, there's a little bit of vignetting, but honestly, it's pretty crisp all the way around. I think the photo, frankly, looks fantastic. Considering it's ISO 1000, f1.8, handheld in low light, honestly, I think it looks just nice. Now, here's something that I would definitely shoot a lot of with this lens. Low light, street scene, street photography kind of thing, f1.8 and a bumped up ISO, in this case 800. But if you zoom in, you can see that this looks beautiful and crisp all here through the center. And moving over the corners, of course, it's going to be a little bit soft and there is some vignetting, but honestly, that's not even something that I would necessarily consider, especially in lower light. When I'm in a city, I'm of course using the light of these stores as my light source, and that area is the focus area in the photo anyway. So slightly soft and slightly vignetted in the corners, not really a big deal to me. And honestly, I think this looks great coming just handheld straight out of the camera. Here's an example of just pretty much shooting straight down the middle in low light, again handheld. You can see that this looks quite nice. We've got some nice depth in the photo. These different signs are all pretty much clear and look good. And again, f1.8, ISO 800. And one more example, once again, f1.8, ISO 800. But I mean, I think if you look through this, that looks nice and crisp and sharp. I was focused pretty much straight down the middle here. And over here, you can see that I've got kind of a little bit of a soft blur on the edges. Again, I'm at f1.8 and focused down the center, so I would expect that, but vignetting doesn't look bad. And it's definitely crisp and sharp in the center, which is where I was focusing. So in summary, overall, I'm really pleased with this lens. I mean, I think it's great value. The 35mm focal length is very useful and versatile, especially for city shots. The f1.8, that bright aperture, fantastic for daytime shots, of course, but especially, I think, useful if you're going to be walking around in a city in lower light, which is something that I would use this lens for and something that I like to do a lot anyway. At $399, I think it's a great value. A couple of things to be aware of. As I said, there is some vignetting in the corners at those bright, wide open apertures, and of course, you may expect the corners to be a little bit softer. Also, there is no image stabilization in the lens, but of course, I have that in camera, and the lens also is not weather sealed. But I think if you're looking for an all-purpose kind of walk-around lens with a versatile focal length with a really bright aperture to give you the ability to carry that lens from day into night in a city and walk around and get shots without lugging a tripod or additional lenses, I think this is a great one, and at $399, I think a great value as well. You can get some beautiful shallow depth of field kind of shots, and you can confidently shoot in lower light, handheld, and walk away with some beautiful photos as a result. So overall, I'm very positive on this lens. I know I'm going to be using it quite a bit. I want to thank the people at Viltrox for sending this over for me to test. I do appreciate that. Hope you found this useful. I'll put a link to that lens down below. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave them. I'll do my best to answer. And thanks for watching, my friends. You guys take care of yourselves. I will see you really soon. And until then, adios.